Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. In the 16th century, from Europe, thousands and thousands of men in search of adventure and fortune embarked on sailing vessels to explore the world and exploit it or conquer it, for better or worse. The fascination and excitement were intense for the riches and wonders of India, China, Persia, the Spice Islands, or a mysterious archipelago east of China called Cipango, Japan, mentioned by Marco Polo more than 200 years before. The sheer size and mystery of Africa, with its steep forests, mountain chains, and deserts, and its gold and ivory, all of this was beginning to unveil to Europeans. In the West, a Spanish expedition, led by Christopher Columbus, had reached what appeared to be a new continent, a land that was increasingly called the West Indies, the New World, or America. The land where Spaniards had begun to build an empire for themselves on a vast and diverse space, where strange civilizations had flourished long before they arrived, and from which they had begun to bring inconceivable quantities of gold and silver. This new world was vast, terrifying, and exciting in equal measures, and its mysteries had barely been unveiled. What other wonders or treasures were hidden in the depths of the Amazonian forest, at the turn of the trail in the Andes Mountains, near the pyramids of Mexico, or the deserts and plains of North America? It seemed that medieval rumors or legends that told of places in the West where gold was abandoned, or even entire cities of gold, might be true after all. This early exploration of America, the excitement for its premises, the encounter and subjugation of empires that owned large quantities of gold, like the Aztecs and the Incas, all of this was fertile soil for new myths to develop. One of the most enduring legends in Europe and among colonists in the New World during the 16th and 17th centuries was the myth of El Dorado, the Golden One, a fabled land or city said to be so rich in gold that it could be gathered from the ground. Together with it, the myth of the 7 cities of gold, 7 hidden cities where houses, monuments, and even streets were said to be made of pure gold and that waited to be found somewhere. For decades, expeditions were sent. Many of them returned empty-handed. Some of them disappeared. But it seems these mysterious places remained undiscovered. Tonight, we are going to explore this myth, how they appeared, because for a part, they were based on legends that existed even before Columbus reached America. What the Spanish conquest of America was like, war, the arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil. We will follow the trail of some of these expeditions across America and see how the quantity of precious metal that was found there changed the world, even though it didn't come from El Dorado or the cities of gold. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you for your support over the past 2 years. I wanted to share a bit about myself. Some of you have wondered if my voice is AI, which is totally understandable these days. So let me clear that up. I'm very much a real person. I grew up in California, spent my teen years abroad, and later lived in the Midwest before settling in Texas, which may explain why some of my pronunciations sound a little different. I discovered this style of content through the French Whisperer, the author of the stories you hear, and we teamed up in 2024 to create Lights Out Library. It has been a learning journey for me, from speaking into a microphone to recording and polishing each episode. We're always looking to improve, so your feedback is welcome. And just to be clear, the podcast is fully written and recorded by two humans, no AI involved. And now just briefly mentioning that we have a Patreon page if you wish to support this project directly and get additional content and features. There is a link in the description of the episode. But now, before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. As I mentioned earlier, even before Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, legends were already circulating in Europe, especially in Portugal, about lost cities somewhere in the West. Columbus himself, however, never set foot on the mainland of the American continent. Over the course of 4 voyages across the Atlantic, he explored part of the Caribbean. On his first and most famous voyage, the so-called Discovery Expedition, he reached islands in what we now call the Bahamas, before sailing along the coast of Cuba and the island of Hispaniola, where the Spanish later founded Santo Domingo. In the second one that immediately followed, he explored more of the Caribbean, and only in the third and fourth voyages did he sail along the coast of the mainland, near Guyana and Central America. This happened between 1492 and 1504. 12 years rich in discoveries and the elaboration of the first maps. But Columbus stayed on the coast. He did not explore inland like his successors would. As you certainly know, Columbus worked for the kings of Spain, who funded his journeys, but he was Italian, from Genoa. The reasons why Spain employed him were several, and they are important to understand the mindset at the time. Of course, there was the appeal of discovery, the curiosity about what the world might be like. There was also the pursuit of prestige. But perhaps most importantly, these voyages were investments, risky ventures with uncertain outcomes, but potentially enormous profits in return. Spain had noted how the Portuguese, decades earlier, along the 15th century, had begun to explore the Atlantic and the coasts of Africa. The Portuguese had founded small island colonies in the Atlantic, and from there, African trade. They extracted significant profits, still nothing in comparison with what they would earn when they would pass the southern tip of Africa to explore the Indian Ocean and go as far as Japan in the 16th century, but still enough to validate the idea that exploration could be lucrative. And when it came to trade, nothing could be more lucrative than finding a way to directly reach Asia by sea. India, China, the islands where spices were harvested in Southeast Asia. This would mean trading directly with these regions, instead of being the end client for goods that had traveled in the hands of Asian and Middle Eastern merchants and arrived in Europe with very inflated prices. The theory that the earth was round meant that it should be possible to reach East Asia traveling westward instead of only eastward, and this was a theory that Columbus's voyages were based on. For several years it was believed, including by Columbus himself, that these islands he had reached were parts of Asia, of Las Indias, or the Indies as they were called. So it was not the only reason, but these expeditions were definitely for profit, and profit there would be. Columbus laid the basis of colonialism in several Caribbean cities. He sent back a bit of gold and slaves to Spain, slaves coming from America, and along the 16th century, profits from the conquest and exploitation of the new continent reached heights that the Spanish could not even have dreamt of before. When the Aztec Empire was subjugated around 1520, and later the Incas in South America, the treasures that were confiscated and sent to Spain were enormous. Entire ships full of gold and precious artifacts, and even more gold and silver would be extracted from New World mines along the 16th and 17th centuries, with gems, jade, and colonial crops. Most of that wealth was spent maintaining the colonies, and even more was lost to corruption and Europe's endless wars. The Spanish crown struggled to hold on to its riches. In fact, Spain declared bankruptcy repeatedly between 1557 and 1666, despite the constant inflow of precious metals from the Americas. For individuals across Europe at the time, what mattered was that this new world could produce inconceivable quantities of gold, of wealth, for those brave enough or foolish enough to explore and seize what they could. Beyond the macroeconomics implications of such an inflow of gold, or issues of public finance, America appeared as a promised land for those dreaming of a quick fortune and adventure. From Europe, or from the American settlements that the colonists had established in the New World, they could read the first accounts and chronicles written by travelers, telling of what they had discovered, what the conquest had been like, or what they had been told by the natives. There were a lot of indirect testimonies and exaggerations that contributed to establishing legends and turning simple rumors into almost certainties or beliefs. It is in this context that the term El Hombre Dorado, the Golden Man, or El Rey Dorado, the Golden King, appeared in the 16th century, the first decades of Spanish presence. It quickly became just El Dorado, and came to name a mythical city or kingdom, but initially it was a person, and the term was inspired by the narrative of a ritual, an initiation ritual that took place in present-day Colombia, a ritual of the Muisca people. One of the early Spanish chronicles of the conquest of the Americas tells of a ritual in which the king of the Muisca was covered from head to toe in gold dust, then immersed himself in a lake, washing it away as his attendants cast gold objects and emeralds into the water as offerings to their gods. Did this ritual truly exist? The answer is uncertain. What we do know is that the Muisca culture possessed significant quantities of gold and precious stones, certainly enough to astonish and impress the Spanish and to fuel their imaginations. They are less famous than the Aztecs or the Incas because they didn't have a large empire. They didn't leave monumental architecture on the same scale. But the Muisca culture formed a confederation in the north of the Andes Mountains, around the region of Bogota, the modern capital of Colombia. Many aspects of this culture remain mysterious because the Muisca left no written records of their own. What we know comes largely from Spanish chronicles, which are not always reliable. These accounts reflect the worldview of 16th century conquistadors, travelers, and clergymen. A more solid foundation comes from archaeology. But what is established is that around the time of their first contacts and conquests, the years 1530, the Muisca had a significant population. Estimates vary from 500,000 to 3 million, and they lived on agriculture, obviously, with a quite advanced knowledge of metalworking and mining. They mined salt too, not just metals. They came from cultures that had developed in this part of Colombia, starting thousands of years earlier. So returning to this golden king, it remains uncertain whether such a ritual truly existed or whether it took a different form. But to Europeans, this apparent disregard for the value of gold, casting it away as an offering to the gods, was astonishing. It could only reinforce the idea that these people must have possessed gold in vast quantities. And here we touch on a big difference in the perceived value of gold between pre-Columbian cultures and Europeans at the time. To all technically advanced pre-Columbian civilizations that had mastered mining and metalwork, gold was precious. It served to make jewelry, ornaments, luxury goods. It was a valuable offering to the gods. So by no means it was seen as one metal among others. It was special. But they also had access to some in quantities that Europeans were unfamiliar with. It was not as rare as it was for the Europeans. In a story about medieval treasures, I told you about the scarcity of gold and silver during the European Middle Ages. These precious metals were scarce because there was not much production in Western and Central Europe. There were a few mines, but the deposits were smaller than what would later be found in America, Africa, or Australia. Europe's own sources of gold and silver had been exploited for centuries, since the time of the Roman Empire, and even earlier. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was no longer a major producer of precious metals. And over time, what gold and silver it did possess tended to flow outward in its trade with the wider world, especially with the Muslim regions of the Middle East and North Africa. Europe was largely a net importer of goods, paying for them with bullion that steadily left the continent. The value of what it bought was structurally higher than what it had to sell, and somehow the difference had to be paid in gold and silver. This made gold rare and highly valuable in Europe, maybe more valuable than anywhere else in the world at the time, relatively at least to the value of goods and assets. And this scarcity cemented the reputation of gold as the ultimate sign of wealth, of value. This perception lasted well beyond the Middle Ages into the 16th and 17th centuries for sure, as we covered in the story about gold. So even though gold was precious and admired by most cultures around the world for its rarity and shine, it carried an even greater weight for European explorers of the time, so much so that their obsession with it was often difficult for pre-Columbian societies to understand. So if a king could afford to cast away gold dust and jewels, as the story claimed, it seems to Europeans to mean only one thing: that he had access to vast quantities of the metal and lived in a land where gold was abundant. From El Dorado as a person, the term became a mythical place, maybe a city or a kingdom, or a region where gold would be abundant. And this was rather credible, because the conquerors of Mesoamerica, of the Aztecs or the Incas in the Andes Mountains, had sent back to Spain entire vessels loaded with gold and other treasures. It did not seem to be such a stretch of the imagination to think that this could be replicated in other places, and to lend credibility to the idea of such a city or land. The hypothesis echoed much older legends, stories that predated Columbus, about lost cities somewhere in the West. What were these legends in Iberia, Spain, and Portugal? There had been for centuries a legend about an island called Antillia, which originated in the Middle Ages. It is said that at the time of the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, 7 Christian bishops would have escaped on ships with their flocks and sailed westward into the Atlantic Ocean to escape the invaders. They would have eventually landed on an island, Antillia, where they would have founded the 7 settlements, 7 cities. And since then, these 7 cities would have lost contact with Europe and the rest of Christendom. Now, these legends about a mythical island somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean came to be even before the 8th century. They already existed since at least classical antiquity. There were tales of utopian islands to the west in different Greek works, like the Fortunate Islands, a place referred to by Homer that would have been an earthly paradise inhabited by the heroes of Greek mythology, or Atlantis, this mythical kingdom or continent that Plato first talked about as a fictional location for a story. But it was picked up and thought to be a real place several centuries after. So the idea circulated in ancient Greece, and later the Romans adopted it. It was not purely fictional. There were real elements that could validate it, like the existence of the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa that were known to the Romans. And actually, the name Canary Islands does not come from canaries, the birds, but from canis, Latin for dog. It means the island of dogs. So these ancient legends about one or several mysterious islands west of Europe already existed. And when they have been around for a long time, legends begin to sound true, with or without a real factual basis. In medieval Europe, these myths endured, often in a new Christian version, and they were not limited to Spain or Portugal. In Ireland, for example, there were the Imrama tales, stories of the sea voyages that spoke of legendary islands in the Atlantic, and of course, the Norse sagas that told of journeys to the west and the discovery of Greenland and Vinland in North America. That brought credibility to the existence of lands west of Europe. The Iberians, too, had concrete elements that made these stories plausible. Apart from the Canaries and Madeira, the Portuguese found the Azores far into the Atlantic. So during the age of exploration in the 15th century, the legend of Antillia and its 7 cities grew in popularity. The island of Antillia was never found, but it started to appear on maps, generally as a rectangle of land in different parts of the ocean, depending on the map. We would find it quite unprofessional today for a cartographer, but putting things on maps that had not been measured or even proven was not uncommon at the time. Apart from Antillia, it also happened in the 16th century on maps of America. The location of El Dorado was put on the maps where it was rumored to be. I will tell you later about these locations. This did not happen much on the more serious maps that were made for explorers and kings, and in the 16th or 17th centuries, the maps were very precious documents that were kept secret. There was also a strong incentive to keep newly discovered routes and overseas colonies secret, to prevent rivals from gaining access to them. So the Portuguese and the Spanish kept their maps for themselves, but other maps of the world, less precise and more colorful, began to be printed for a broader audience, often coming with the accounts, the chronicles of journeys to America, Africa, or Asia. These maps were how the general public first began to form an idea of what the world beyond Europe looked like. But seeing El Dorado or the island of Antillia on them could only give credibility to their myth, and this was another reason that made their existence plausible. So, with the excitement of the treasures that had been seized and imagining what remained to be found, searching for El Dorado or the 7 lost cities sounded reasonable, or at least worth investigating and taking risks. The 7 cities supposedly founded on the island of Antillia became 7 cities of gold in America in the years following the conquest of Mexico in the 1520s and 1530s. About 30 years after the first voyage of Columbus, a rumor of imprecise or unknown origin began to spread among the Spaniards, now staying in Mexico, called New Spain at the time. A rumor saying that these 7 cities would be located hundreds of miles to the north, which would have put them somewhere in the north of modern Mexico or the southwest of the United States. The rumors were largely fed by reports from the survivors of an expedition to Florida that had shipwrecked, and when the survivors returned to New Spain, they said that the natives had told them stories about cities with great wealth, almost unlimited wealth. In 1539, the Italian explorer Estevanico traveled as far north as the Zuni Pueblo in present-day New Mexico and returned with stories of extraordinary riches, stories that would help fuel the legend of the 7 cities of gold. An expedition was sent to this place, but when they arrived, they only found adobe and straw villages. The promised golden cities were nowhere to be found. But this same expedition, as they were near Zuni Pueblo, heard an additional rumor from the natives about a city with plenty of gold located on the other side of the Great Plains, and the leader of this expedition, Coronado, decided to check. They crossed the Great Plains and arrived at what is supposed to be modern Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri. But here again, no city of gold was found, so the expedition finally returned to New Spain, disappointed. The 7 cities of gold remained elusive, but the fact that they were not found did not mean they did not exist. It even added to the mystery and the appeal of the rumor. So, the story of the legendary 7 cities endured in New Spain among colonists, and it traveled back to Europe, where it excited people's imaginations, even though the real origin of the legend might well be somewhere in Portugal and Spain, where the legend of Antillia and its 7 seas had been present long before the exploration of the New World. But the legend of the 7 cities of gold never reached the same level of fame as El Dorado. By the 1530s, El Dorado was already being spoken of as a wealthy kingdom yet to be discovered. These rumors only intensified the search for gold in South America, a quest that had begun a few years earlier with the expeditions of various explorers. These expeditions were not just Spanish or Portuguese. News of the discovery of a western route to a new world, and of the Portuguese explorations around Africa and beyond, had spread quickly at the beginning of the 16th century. In a matter of years, the kings of England and France also sent their expeditions across the Atlantic. They were willing to discover their own routes, maybe to China by the west, or claim new lands. But the people participating in all these expeditions came from different countries. There were many Italians, starting with Columbus, employed by different kingdoms because they were good sailors. There were also Germans and Dutch. In the 16th century, the crown of Spain became part of the Habsburg Empire. Charles V ruled simultaneously over Spain, Austria, Burgundy, and the Low Countries. As Holy Roman Emperor, he also held authority across much of the German lands and exercised significant influence in Italy. So to an extent, traders, explorers, adventurers from Germany and Italy also were involved. For example, the first expeditions inland of what became Venezuela in search of gold and other riches happened by the end of the 1520s by agents of a German banking family, the Wetzler family, which had received a concession from the King of Spain to exploit this region. Apart from Mexico, which had been recently conquered, this was one of the first regions where expeditions were sent deep inland to discover what existed beyond the coastline. The Orinoco River was explored, but this first expedition failed in finding large quantities of gold or even large cities like the ones found in Mexico. The encounters with the natives were often violent. The climate was also hostile, and between the diseases and the harassment of native tribes, many died, and these expeditions did not achieve more than recognize the land and draw maps. But this didn't discourage explorers, quite the opposite, because in the 1530s, the legend of El Dorado had taken shape based on this Muisca initiation ritual that I told you about earlier. The Golden One, the Muisca king, had become the golden city in people's imagination, and the search only intensified. In and around Colombia, the Muisca land, as I said earlier, was in central Colombia, around the city of Bogota. Until the year 1530, there had been contacts with the Muisca and other peoples in the north of South America, but no conquest like in Mexico. America was vast, and between the distances and the limited number of men, the capacity to conquer was limited. In the 1530s, this changed. The Aztecs had fallen in Mexico, and the Spanish were now looking to the south. They had arrived at the Inca border in 1528, and after years of preliminary exploration and a few skirmishes, the conquest really began in 1532. A group of a few dozen soldiers, not more, with their indigenous allies, ambushed an Inca force and captured the emperor, the Sapa Inca Atahualpa, at the Battle of Cajamarca in the north of Peru. This move completely stunned the Incas. Thousands were massacred without a single dead on the Spanish side, and this was the start of the campaign that saw the largest pre-Columbian empire subjugated. It fell quickly, but it took about 40 years to entirely pacify it. The conquest was achieved by no more than a few dozen Spanish, even though they were helped by native peoples revolting against the Incas, and also a war of succession that was taking place within the Inca Empire when they launched the offensive. While this was happening in Peru, the invaders actually did not come directly from Mexico by land, because no route through Colombia and Ecuador had been established yet. They came by sea, sailing south of South America through the Strait of Magellan, reaching the Pacific Ocean, and then back north all the way up to Peru. Colombia was hard to travel by land, and it remained mysterious, apart from a few expeditions that had ventured into it. And even more mysterious was this gigantic forest south of Venezuela and east of the Andes, the forest that would soon be known as the Amazonian forest. But land routes had to be explored and opened. So in 1536, a Spanish conquistador, Quesada, and an army of 800 men were sent on a mission to find an overland route to Peru. But Spanish conquerors were rather independent from the authorities. They received missions and promises of titles and their share of the booty. but there was no one to check on them during the months or years they explored, far from the eyes of the authorities. So when Quesada was sent to find an overland route to Peru, he was instead drawn off course by stories of El Dorado. Abandoning his original mission, he turned toward the lands of the Muisca, conquered them, and seized their treasures. Yet as substantial as the plunger was, it fell far short of the boundless wealth promised by the rumors. Once there, he received reports from captured natives about a kingdom whose inhabitants had built a temple to the sun and filled it with an enormous quantity of gold and jewels. He tried to look for it for another year, but was not successful. Still, Quesada did not renounce easily the Golden King. The Muisca legend spoke of a king and a sacred lake into which precious objects were said to have been cast for centuries. Quesada reasoned that if he could find this lake, perhaps some of those treasures might still be recovered. The Muisca did have a sacred lake, and the ritual did exist indeed, at least to some extent. The lake was found in 1537, Lake Guatavita, but it looked too large and deep, and the bottom too muddy to recover anything. However, 8 years later, in 1545, 2 other conquistadors attempted to drain the lake. The only way they could think of was to organize a chain of laborers with buckets that would slowly empty the lake. But after 3 months, the level had been reduced by only 3 meters, 10 feet, and only a small amount of gold was recovered, not enough to continue, and so this was abandoned. They stopped. And that was not the end of the story for Lake Guatavita. In 1580, so that's 40 years later, another attempt was made to dry the lake by cutting a deep notch into the rim of the lake. The notch eventually collapsed, but the level had decreased by 20 meters this time, and more golden ornaments and jewelry were found. Finally, the attempts ended much later in the early 20th century. This time the lake was drained completely by a tunnel dug under it. Only about 4 feet of mud remained, but only a few pieces were found in this mud, which quickly dried and set like concrete. So it seems the narratives about the Muisca Golden King were not baseless. There was a lake. Gold artifacts were thrown into it, but based on what was recovered along these different attempts, either they didn't throw that much gold, or the pieces got lost in the mud, or it was another lake. Meanwhile, the vast conquest of the Incan Empire had advanced, and the Spanish had now reached Cusco. They had seized the capital. It was not specifically to pursue the myth of El Dorado, but in 1541, another expedition departed from Quito, Ecuador, to explore lands to the east, that is to say, towards the inside of the continent, because many natives had talked of the existence of a valley far to the east that would have been rich in gold and cinnamon. Spices were not really the main thing the Spanish searched for in America, but they were still very valuable. It is unclear whether the natives actually believed in the existence of this valley, if it was a legend of theirs, or if the accounts were exaggerated. But in any case, this was another lead to find more gold, and an expedition departed Quito, led by two conquistadors, Pizarro and Orellana. Pizarro was the name of the main conqueror of the Incan Empire, Francisco Pizarro. But in this expedition it was his younger brother, Gonzalo Pizarro. Gonzalo quit the expedition after many of their soldiers and native porters had died of hunger, diseases, or attacks by hostile natives. He let the other leader, Orellana, go on with the instructions to continue downstream on a river. This river was one of the many tributaries to the Amazon River, and Orellana went downstream until he eventually made it to the Atlantic Ocean. They found no gold nor cinnamon, but Orellana had followed the Amazon River, which was named so because of a tribe of warriors that attacked them on their voyage. And either these were women, or their long hair made them think of women, that they named this river Amazon, after the Amazon warriors of Greek mythology. By the middle of the 16th century, El Dorado still had not been found, but the legend's credibility was not harmed by this detail, and with good reason. Even if it was not El Dorado, a lot of gold and silver had been seized in the Inca Empire, and now it appeared that the mines of Mexico or Peru and Bolivia could provide even more. In this land, golden nuggets could turn up on the bed of rivers. New sources of gold, diamonds, and emeralds were also discovered and brought into exploitation. South America remained a dangerous place where tropical diseases, wild animals, or hostile natives could kill even the bravest adventurer. But it was not like it had delivered nothing. Actual treasures could be found there. They had been found. And El Dorado was still awaiting, even though no one remembered or knew precisely how this rumor existed or how it had appeared. The longer a legend endures, the more believable it can seem. When generations of people search for the same thing, convinced of its existence, it becomes easy to assume that there must be a spark of truth behind the story, that there is no smoke without fire. Following this logic, it meant that El Dorado just had to be found in regions that had not been well explored yet, and there were still many in the late 16th century. Maybe El Dorado was not in Colombia, not in the Andes, but then it had to be somewhere in the heart of the Amazonian forest or the plateau of Guyana, places that were hard to access and very hostile to travelers. By the late 16th century, rumors placed El Dorado on a great lake, Lake Parime or Parima, an almost inland sea said to lie somewhere between southern Venezuela, northern Brazil, and Guyana. And because there was this tradition of placing hypothetical things on maps, plenty of maps of the late 16th and 17th centuries featured Lake Parime in different locations. It was actually not the only mythical lake on early maps of South America. Others, like Lake Cassipa, were also featured on maps until it appeared they simply did not exist. So, expeditions went in search of Lake Parime, hoping it would lead them to El Dorado. One of the most notable is the expedition of Walter Raleigh in 1594-1595. Walter Raleigh was an important figure of the Elizabethan era in England, the time of Queen Elizabeth I. He was a statesman, a soldier, a writer, and an explorer who, among other things, played a leading role in the early English colonization of North America. He also wrote accounts of his journeys, accounts that were extremely appealing to the readers in Europe, and that also mixed facts and fictions or fabricated elements that embellished them. In 2 books he published after his expedition to the Guianas on the Atlantic coast of South America, he embraced the idea that Lake Parime was real and that it was the location of El Dorado. He never went there, but based on accounts he heard or imagined, maybe, he spoke extensively of the lake and the city of El Dorado. He described the lake's dimensions and said that the lake itself was the source of the gold possessed by the inhabitants of El Dorado. Grains of gold would have been abundant and easy to recover in this lake and its tributaries, according to what he wrote. After his return to England, he sent a lieutenant back to Guyana in search of the city, but it was never found, and again, because he believed it was real, he himself returned in 1617, but was now an old man and stayed behind in the Caribbean. When he returned to England, his time in royal favor had passed, and he found little support under Elizabeth's successor, King James. During his earlier ventures in the New World, he had clashed with Spanish forces despite the king's strict orders to avoid such conflicts. For this he was put on trial and ultimately executed in 1618, bringing a remarkably extraordinary life to a tragic end. Anyway, his second expedition did not reveal anything new, either about the lake or El Dorado. They both remained missing, which was conceivable for a city lost in the jungle, but for an entire lake that at some point was said to be as large as the Caspian Sea, this was becoming hard to believe. Still, other expeditions led by Spanish, English, German, and Dutch travelers departed for the same region. Inland Guyana, south of Venezuela, north of Brazil, at least one every decade in the 17th century, and they found nothing. As the exploration and colonization of South America had turned more methodical, now fewer regions were unknown. The perimeter where El Dorado could have been located shrank, but it did not disappear. Like Central Africa, South America was filled with immense, hard-to-reach regions where dense forests could hide almost anything. For European explorers, familiar with the many versions of the El Dorado legend, these blank spaces on the map seemed to promise hidden wonders just beyond reach. After nearly 2 centuries of searching, the idea of El Dorado was beginning to sound almost like a joke. The final hopes attached to this particular expedition and to Lake Parime itself faded at the turn of the 19th century, when Alexander von Humboldt carried out extensive scientific surveys of the river basins and lakes of Guyana. Alexander von Humboldt was a German geographer, explorer, and scholar who carried out extensive work in South America. Unlike many earlier adventurers, he applied systematic, scientific principles to his explorations, an approach that would later be adopted by figures such as Charles Darwin and other naturalists. He concluded that Lake Parime could not exist, but that maybe a confluence of rivers and their seasonal floods could have created a temporary large body of water that could have inspired the legend of a lake, but that there was no such thing, and also no El Dorado city was found anywhere in this region. So Lake Parime did not exist. Or did it? By the 19th century, the hypothesis had been abandoned, and El Dorado was increasingly understood as a legend rather than a clue to some fabulous golden city still waiting to be found. The city remains mythical to our days. Nothing close was ever found, and the meaning of El Dorado, of the term, shifted from a hypothetical place to a concept. It became a synonym for promised land or ultimate prize, which is what the term generally is used for nowadays. Yet in the 20th century, the possibility that such a lake might once have existed was revisited, with some intriguing findings. Geologists noticed that in northern Brazil, old hillsides bore a distinct horizontal line at a uniform level. This shoreline of sorts marked the former water level of a now extinct lake that had existed until relatively recent geological times. It would have been very sizable, 30,000 square miles, about the size of Austria or South Carolina, and almost the size of Lake Superior. In summary, a giant lake about 700 years ago. So that would be 200 years before the arrival of Europeans. The lake began to drain, and in 1690, so now that's well after the first Spanish expeditions and a century after Walter Raleigh, an earthquake is thought to have happened, a fault in the bedrock that would have permitted all the water to flow into a river and reach the ocean, following the Amazon River. So the lake would have disappeared, but it existed before and probably during these expeditions in search of El Dorado. It seems it was not found then, but its mention by the natives made sense if this was true. And ironically, the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries that featured the lake might not have been entirely wrong, even though it was put in the wrong place and with an exaggerated size. And even better, people lived nearby. Near the site of this vanished lake lies Pedra Pintada, a rock shelter known for its pre-Columbian pictographs. It is, of course, speculative, but some have suggested that gold could once have been recovered from the lake itself, washed down by streams and rivers from the Andean mountains, and then transported across the Amazonian lowlands. So maybe there was a base to these stories after all. These stories that Spanish conquistadors and other explorers heard in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Guyana, that kept the expeditions alive for 200 years and fed the myth of El Dorado in this region. It may not have been a land overflowing with gold, certainly not an entire city covered in it, but there may well have been something real at the origin of the story, something that allowed the legend to take root. It reminds us not to dismiss myths as mere inventions or simple wishful thinking. They can be, but more often than not, they are based on the retelling or the exaggeration or the displacement of places and events that did exist and help understand how the myth was born. We have come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now, you can let go and sleep, or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night, sleep well.